The overcast stitch is sort of a cross between a couching stitch and a satin stitch. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to thread our needle with whatever thread or cord we want for our laid thread. That's just going to be a loose one that's going to be laid on the line, and you'll just hold it with your thumb as you go. I did see a few diagrams from old texts where you could actually couch it, just some quick tack stitches to hold it in place. Once we have brought our laid thread to the top, then we're going to unthread our needle. We're going to rethread the needle with the thread that we're going to do our basically satin stitch with. We're going to bring it up on one side of the laid thread. I did use a different color for my laid thread. I would recommend you match it if you're working on a project, but I want you to be able to see it. So I'll bring my thread up on one side. I'm going to come down on the other. And I found that I got a prettier stitch if I just caught the fabric under the laid thread rather than trying to go up and down on the sides of it. And we're just going to keep repeating that. And where the satin stitch comes in is you're going to keep your stitches, when you're stitching this down, parallel to each other, right next to each other. So it's just down on one side, up on the other, then back around. And again, I thought it was prettier if I caught the stitch in the fabric under the laid thread rather than on the two sides of it. That's my opinion. So it's not a difficult stitch to execute. It can be harder than it looks to make it pretty. It is a good stitch for stems or vines if you want them to stand up a little bit. So it does have a dimensional quality to it. It sits on top of the fabric. Just like with a satin stitch, a hoop is a good idea if you can do it, because it just keeps everything taut while you're working, so it's not pulling up too tight. When I'm pulling my thread when I come through, I'm not pulling it super tight. You are going to want to work on having consistent tension on that thread, because if you pull it real tight for one stitch and then looser for another, you're going to get bumps. And that might be something you want if you're doing seaweed or some lumpy vines. Oops. So I'm just going to keep going until I get all the way to the other end. When we get to the end of our line, we're going to rethread our laid thread and take it to the wrong side of the fabric and knot it off. And I waited to finish off the thread I was stitching with, just in case I had a little bit showing of the laid thread. You probably wouldn't have to worry about that if you had used matching thread, but so you're going to just finish that off and also take it to the wrong side and knot it off. This is where I was first playing. In both cases, I used 6 strands of embroidery floss for my laid thread. I started out here treating this like a satin stitch, so doing the stab stitch, where I was going up on one side, down on the other, just with my needle straight up, straight down. And it stayed kind of flat, and it was very hard to keep it even. At this point, I was using 3 strands of floss to stitch over my laid thread. Somewhere around here, I started switching to where I was just taking a stitch under the laid thread instead of trying to go on each side, and it started looking better. And then I started thinking, well, if this is kind of a cross between a couching stitch and a satin stitch, what if I switched to just 1 strand of floss? Would I have a smoother look? So somewhere around here, I switched to one strand of floss, and it definitely does look smoother. So you kind of have to consider the trade-offs. Do you want it super smooth, and you might for some things, or do you want to get it done faster? And sometimes you might want the more knobby or twisted look if you were doing a stem or seaweed or something like that. For my S, I actually used 2 strands of floss when I was stitching over the top. So it's kind of just decide what look you want and then go for it. It will take a little bit of practice to get it to be smooth. Just real quick, this is the back after I did the overcast stitch. I wanted to point out this is where I was trying to do the satin stitch, so the stab stitch. And then when I switched over and started just taking that little stitch under my laid thread, this is what it looks like. Do keep in mind though, this is wool felt, so my stitches kind of disappear. You would have little tiny stitches on the back if you were working on cotton.